They thought he was powerless. A quiet black man, living on land passed down through generations, suddenly found himself surrounded by construction crews, bulldozers, and developers. Overnight, his peaceful fields became a battleground of greed. What the Homeowners Association didn't know was that this man wasn't just a bystander. He held a secret that could bring their million-dollar project crashing down. As the first walls of 120 homes rose high, so did the trap he had quietly set. But what happens when greed collides with justice?
For years, David lived quietly on the land his grandfather once tilled with his own hands. It wasn't just property to him, it was history, a living memory of resilience passed down through generations. His modest home sat among wide fields, where the sun seemed to linger just a little longer each evening. Neighbors knew him as the man who kept to himself, respectful, hardworking, and fiercely proud of what his family had built. But David's land carried more than just memories. It carried value. Unbeknownst to him at first, developers had been eyeing it for months. To them, it wasn't the legacy or a symbol of family pride. It was just prime real estate. Plans for sleek houses, tidy streets, and profitable deals were already being drawn up behind closed doors. Still, David continued his daily routines, tending to his garden, repairing fences, and walking the boundary lines his grandfather once walked. He felt safe, believing his family's roots ran too deep to be disturbed. Yet, subtle signs began to appear. Strangers surveying the edges of his land, stakes driven into the soil without his consent, and conversations that went quiet whenever he passed by. What seemed like harmless curiosity soon revealed itself as something far more sinister. Piece by piece, David began to realize that powerful hands were moving against him, hands that believed his voice didn't matter. The peace he had always known was about to be shattered, and the fight for his land and his dignity was only just beginning.
The first real shock came on a quiet morning when David woke to the thunder of engines outside his window. Dust filled the air as heavy trucks rolled across the field that had been in his family for nearly a century. At first, he thought it had to be some kind of mistake. But when he stepped outside, men in hard hats ignored him completely, waving blueprints and shouting over the noise of bulldozers tearing into the soil. When David demanded to know what was happening, a site manager brushed him off with a smirk. "This isn't your land anymore," the man said, casually, as if centuries of history could be erased with a single sentence. The words stung. His heart raced as he watched strangers uproot the very ground his grandfather had once worked with his bare hands. Days turned into weeks, and each morning the construction grew louder, faster, and more invasive. Entire sections of his property were carved into neat rows for houses he had never approved, and yet the developers acted as though he was invisible. When he showed him his deed, they laughed. When he went to the local office for help, he was met with dismissive stares and endless delays. It was as if every door had been closed before he even knocked. Behind the scenes, whispers began to spread. Comments about how he wasn't the kind of man the neighborhood wanted owning so much land, how he was better off moving on. It wasn't just greed, it was prejudice, sharpened into a weapon. David could feel it every time a city official shrugged at his complaints, every time workers ignored his protests, every time neighbors looked away rather than stand with him. But while they underestimated him, David was quietly gathering his strength. Each night, he pored over documents, contracts, and property lines, searching for the flaw in their scheme. His frustration grew into determination. If they wanted to bury him beneath their wealth and influence, then he would dig deeper than they ever expected. By the time the first row of houses stood tall on his soil, David was no longer the silent man in the background. He was preparing something far more powerful than protests or angry words. something that could bring the entire development and everyone behind it crashing down. The question was, would he strike before they stripped him of everything?
The breaking point came on a scorching afternoon when David returned home to find his driveway blocked by a line of cement trucks. The air reeked of fresh asphalt, and the sound of jackhammers shook the ground beneath his feet. In stunned silence, he watched as workers poured concrete just inches from his front porch, laying the foundation for a house that would stand on land still legally bearing his family's name. He shouted, his voice raw, demanding they stop. But no one listened. Some smirked. Others shrugged, as if his outrage was nothing more than background noise against the roar of machinery. One man even told him coldly, "You should be grateful. We're raising the value of this neighborhood." Grateful. The word sliced through him. Grateful for the theft of his heritage? Grateful for the erasure of his family's history? He felt the weight of generations pressing down, as if his grandfather's calloused hands and his father's unyielding spirit were watching. Yet here he was, a lone man being erased in real time. His neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their silence louder than any words. Not one stepped forward. Not one offered support. In that moment, David felt a crushing loneliness, a helplessness so sharp it nearly stole his breath. It was racism and greed intertwined, powerful enough to strip him not only of land, but of dignity, if he allowed it. But then, amid chaos, David's eyes locked on the very papers he had kept hidden, tucked safely away, a weapon no bulldozer could crush. His fear transformed into something sharper – resolve. The trucks kept pouring. The hammers kept pounding. Yet beneath the noise, a storm was gathering, one that would turn their arrogance against them. And when it struck, it would leave every single one of them reeling.
The developers thought they had buried him. They believed the noise, the machinery, and their connections made him powerless. But what they didn't see was the quiet fire David had been fueling all along. When he walked into court, he carried more than worn papers and dusty deeds. He carried his family's history, ironclad property records, and a strategy that left their lawyers scrambling. Page after page, David proved the land was his, every square foot protected by law. And when the judge's gavel struck, it echoed louder than any bulldozer. The ruling was clear. Every single home built on his soil now belonged to him. The once confident developers sat stunned. Their million-dollar project had crumbled, not from storms or accidents, but from the arrogance that blinded them to the man they'd tried to erase. For David, it wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was about reclaiming dignity, about showing that his voice carried weight no matter how much they tried to silence it. But the victory was bittersweet. The houses remained, the scars on his land still visible. And in those scars lay a truth larger than one man's fight, that racism often hides beneath contracts, handshakes, and polite smiles, striking hardest when people believe no one will resist. David's stand became more than a personal triumph. It became a reminder that silence allows injustice to grow, that history is stolen piece by piece when voices are ignored. His courage was proof that standing firm can turn the tide, but also a warning of how fragile justice can be when prejudice is written into the foundation of power. So the question remains, how many more Davids are out there fighting battles no one sees? And how many will stand with them before another legacy is buried under concrete and greed?